We've seen how America was won over to Donald Trump, second time round. Do you think an election could be bought here?
He has had a go at absolutely everyone and everything to do with the Labour government. He stood up for the farmers. I'm sure Elon Musk feels very, very close to the plight of smallholding farmers around Britain. It is weird.
And he would be able to funnel huge amounts of money for the next 5 years online. Digital, the rest of it. It will be game-changing.
Is this true? Is it going to happen?
I have absolutely no idea where this story comes from. What I do know is that Elon Musk is very supportive of me, what I'm trying to do, and he thinks that if reform do well in the UK, we can bring about the same kind of change that he intends to do with Donald Trump in America. All of that is true. Yes, he is very supportive, but honestly,
in case you hadn't guessed, that was Nigel Farage talking about Elon Musk and the prospect of Mr. Musk getting out his chequebook and writing a cheque to the Reform Party in much the same way as he did to Donald Trump's campaign. $100 million, which would be extraordinary.
Or £79 million in British money. This money, this donation, does not yet exist in any real or tangible form. But can you imagine a world in which Elon Musk could essentially buy a UK election? Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And we're going to be talking about Nigel Farage and whether he might soon be the happy recipient of some $100 million from Elon Musk. But before that...
Yes, what are you going to get your loved ones for Christmas? Or what might you be buying in a secret Santa? Does the voice sound kind of really like you want to throw up?
It's very QVC.
Yes.
Yeah, it's
like
QVC. Well, we've got the perfect solution for you here at the Newsagents, because on the 17th of February, we're live at the Birmingham Symphony Hall and tickets go on sale today. We're live on the 24th of February at the Bridgewater Hall, Manchester, and on the 11th of March at the Usher Hall in Edinburgh.
New Year cheer.
New Year cheer.
By the Newsagents.
So if you want to get tickets, they're available now on Global Player.
And the good news is that you can buy them for considerably less than Elon Musk is proposing. Do you like that for a segue?
Oh, segue. That was seamless,
it was worthy of John Sopel himself, the Sopel segue. You can buy them for considerably less than Elon Musk is reporting to be prepared to pay for to get involved in British politics at the tune of $100 million, which would be by far and away, if it's true, and Nigel Farage, as you heard at the top there, is suggesting it might not be true, but it has been quite extensively reported.
But he's also
now.
suggesting it might be true.
Well, and if it were, I'm sure he wouldn't be entirely displeased by the fact, right? And if it were to be the case, it would be by far and away the biggest donation ever given in the history of British politics to any political party at any point. It would be completely game-changing when you consider that, you know, the total amount, the maximum cap during a general election campaign is currently set for a big party at £35 million. So when you consider this is nearly £90 million, you can see it would be a huge, huge, huge amount of money.
And you said something really interesting there, which is in an election campaign. And of course, there are questions about whether this would be legal, whether it would be possible. And one of the loopholes that could allow this is if Elon Musk doesn't give it to a reform party in the middle of an election campaign, but does give it to Nigel Farage via another UK vehicle, i.e. Tesla UK, in a period outside of an election. In other words, if it is made to seem apolitical and part of a donation to a person through a corporation, then it is not treated in the same way. And clearly this is sparking all kind of nightmares for both the Tories and Labour, because they have to decide whether they're going to take steps before this donation even exists and tighten up campaign financing or non-campaign financing, or whether they have to just sit on this and watch it and see what they can do. Because if it does come outside of a campaign, then they're not actually going to be able to put any rules in place that could put a stop to it. And I think right now you have got Keir Starmer's Labour Party, the government in other words, talking about electoral reform measures which wouldn't even come into play in this parliament, you know. So if they're talking about changes to kind of election campaigning, all the rest of it, those aren't even due in this Parliament. They wouldn't even be due for 2026. So in other words, they are way behind on this when any action from Musk could literally happen in a transfer overnight.
Since 2010, there was this case brought to the Supreme Court called Citizens United versus the Federal Electoral Commission. And that was a case which meant essentially, under the First Amendment, Citizens United argued that there should be no limits on what you can spend in an election. And that case was won 5-4 with a Conservative majority on the Supreme Court. And it now means that, Lewis, you were talking a moment ago about the 35 million cap that you can spend in a UK general election. I mean, Kamala Harris had $1.5 billion to spend in the presidential election that has just gone.
And we should point out it didn't work.
And it didn't work.
It didn't work, although it almost certainly, it stemmed the losses, right? I mean, where they spent most money, they lost by the narrowest amount. So it didn't work in totality, but it still works.
So I think the key is how you spend it, which is, you know, the old school of sort of campaign financing is ads, leaflet drops, knocking door to door. The modern school of spending that kind of money is buying up databases. Buying up databases from sort of credit companies, from places that are going bust. What they want, and what Musk understands better than anyone, is you just need data. You need people's addresses. You need to know where they live. You need to know their history. You need to know what they're inclined to believe in and vote for, and all the rest of it. And as we've seen with Trump, with Steve Bannon on the War Room, the ground game starts 2 or 3 years earlier, when they basically create their foot soldiers by working out what people are scared of, what people believe in. Is it 15-minute cities? Is it the PTA? Is it books in the library? Is it the trans issue? And that's how you start the ground game, with data, knowing your people.
I think it's worth just zooming out for a moment and saying that obviously we don't know if this is going to happen or not, but I don't think it's too much hyperbole to say that if it were to happen, that we would not have seen such a game-changing and I think dangerous moment in British politics for some time. I think we would never have seen such a powerful man. We're not just talking about, we've had plenty of rich people get involved in British politics before. We've seen plenty of foreign media moguls get involved in British politics before. What we have never seen is the world's richest man, who now owns one of the biggest information networks and platforms in the world, who has a very clear political agenda, who right now, at least, for the moment, basically has, or will have, the American state in his pocket, or extremely close to him in the form of Donald Trump, potentially trying to actively subvert British politics. And we know he has an agenda. And just to remind people, right now, and this is why I think if this is anything like serious, Emily's right. There is a rumour that Labour are thinking about tightening these rules and election rules quickly. And they would need to do so. Because right now, under the Political Parties Elections and Referendum Act 2000, there is no legal limit on the amount an individual can donate to a political party, campaign or candidate in the UK. There are spending limits during the campaign, but outside of the campaign, there is no limit. And if Musk can find a way to donate via one of his companies, which has a significant presence in the UK. Yes, I'm sure it will be subject to legal challenge, but he also has very, very, very powerful legal methods at his disposal. And he would be able to funnel huge amounts of money for the next 5 years online, digital, the rest of it. It will be game-changing.
But the thing we've left out so far is the extraordinary level of interest, some might say unhealthy level of interest, that he has taken in UK politics since the general election, since they were sparked by the riots that followed the Southport killings, that have carried on incessantly, where he seems to be at war with a picture of a Labour government, for all its faults, that it just seems kind of a bizarre caricature that Britain has turned into a police state where decent people can't go out and protest without being arrested and thrown in prison for having the right of free speech, and yet all sorts of weirdos are being released from our prisons. He has had a go at absolutely everyone and everything to do with the Labour government. He stood up for the farmers. I'm sure Elon Musk feels very, very close to the plight of smallholding farmers around Britain. It is weird that this guy, who is sitting on Donald Trump's shoulder day in, day out, has effectively shaped the cabinet that Trump will have around him, by making sure that there are loads of radicals in there, has paid $100 million to Donald Trump. And what access, by God, he has got in return, now wants to do the same in Britain.
And I think if we take you behind the curtain for a moment, we should admit that we have been messaging this morning quite a few politicians in both parties to see if anyone would like to speak on this. And there was a definite reluctance to put their head above the parapet. Even people who said, I hate dirty money in campaigning, I hate dirty money in politics, I'm not sure I'm going to help. If I talk about Elon Musk, it will only fuel the fringe radicals. And so what you're seeing now is the people who are getting closer to Musk again. Keir Starmer has tried to play, I think, a very straight bat, actually, since he came into power and since Musk started having a go at him. He's not going to cave into him, but he's not picking fights. It looks like Boris Johnson has actually renewed a friendship with Musk in recent weeks, and he has been sort of reintroduced by a venture capitalist who was the same person that helped Musk acquire Twitter back in 2022. Interesting to see if there is some kind of relationship being forged there. Tony Blair also has a pretty good, warm, whatever, relationship with Musk. And I guess that's what you'll see. You'll see some people who are coming towards the beast and saying, that's the way you defang, you declaw. And there'll be some people, but we're not finding them yet, who will say, this is crazy. This is really, as you said, this is a really dangerous moment.
It's a threat to democracy. It's a threat to UK democracy from a foreign citizen who wants to kind of shape what our next general election looks like and has unbelievable power.
Okay, so I'm going to ask this. We've seen how America was won over to Donald Trump, second time round. And we've kind of looked in the past at the reasons for that, partly to do with inflation, partly to do with incumbency, partly to do, frankly, with conspiracy and lie. Do you think an election could be bought here?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because
I mean, we sometimes shout, oh, we've got the BBC and the King.
But these institutions, as we know, the fact that we even sat here to some extent doing what we're doing shows, the plurality of media which is available, or the hold and the hegemony of old media institutions has never been weaker. And by the time of the next general election, will be weaker still. Our law as well, and this is something that neither Labour nor Tories have grappled with, partly because for self-interested reasons, but I think this might change it. Our law in terms of what is possible online and in the digital sphere is almost non-existent by comparison to the highly regulated laws that we have with traditional broadcast, television, radio, as we know and have had experience of over many years. Compare how tightly regulated party political broadcasts are or TV packages are during a by-election to the absolute wild west that there is online, which is something that neither Labour, as I say, or Tories have tried to grapple with. And I think, look, if there's one thing that could make Labour and Tory come together over this issue of party financing and digital regulation for politics, which is something that, as we know, neither have wanted to do for their own reasons. Labour don't want to touch union funding. The Tories won't do it unless Labour touch union funding, and they don't want to touch it for business interests and so on. This could bring them together. I mean, this could bring them together because if Musk were serious about giving to reform, not the Tories, but to reform, who is potentially the biggest loser even more than Labour than that? It's the Conservative Party.
Except that's not the line they've been playing. So Richard Holden, who's former Tory party chairman, was saying, his message to Musk is you're just helping Labour stay in power. You should be giving to us instead. So it doesn't sound like there is an olive branch at the moment between the two main parties.
No, but if it did seriously start to come about and it would look to be realised, let me give you an example of what I mean. I mean, we've got 2026 elections coming in Scotland and Wales, right? There was a poll out at the weekend which showed Reform were basically neck and neck with the Tories and Labour in Wales, right? If the Reform can overtake the Conservatives in the 2026 Welsh Senate elections, which, by the way, I think there is every possibility of doing because UKIP, the Brexit Party, now Reform, have always actually done very well in the South Wales valleys. The party that would be most destabilising to would be the Conservative Party. It would probably knock Badenoch off her perch as Conservative leader because then Reform would be able to say, we're the party of the right. We're the insurgent party of the right in British politics and we will overtake the Tories.
And maybe bring back a Johnson figure at that point because he seems to be on the same wavelength as Elon Musk.
Completely.
I mean, we should just explain, if people are kind of going, why are these guys getting so het up? Reform have got 5 seats. That is part of our parliamentary system and they did get 4 million votes. They got 4 million votes
Yeah.
at the last general election, but they were so evenly spread that you needed around 800,000 people for each Reform seat, whereas the Lib Dems worked very efficiently, and for every seat they only needed about 50,000 votes. So if you see how the money can be used, it's all about working up the areas where Reform came second. We know they came second about 100 places, and 50 of those are actually Labour seats now.
The two things I would say about all of this are, the first thing is, and maybe this is naive and optimistic of me and ridiculous, I think that if it becomes apparent that that much money has been funneled in from the US to Farage, there will be a backlash against it.
What
there
if
will
it
be
doesn't become apparent?
Yeah,
What if we don't ever know about it?
Yeah, but if they've suddenly got huge sums of money to spend, I kind of think the British people,
one way or the
yeah,
other.
the British people would kind of think this is wrong. I think there is a sense of fair play and justice about it. The other thing I would say is it's a policy question, that you really do need to make progress on the immigration issue, because that is the issue that is driving the Reform vote. And if Keir Starmer can get anything done on that and, blunt their weapons, then that is the best thing that
I think
Keir
you've
Starmer
raised
could do.
the most interesting question about populism right now, I mean, in our country and everywhere else, is if those problems went away, would people actually stop voting Reform, or would another one just come up the agenda? I mean, for a moment, we thought that UKIP existed to, bring about Brexit. Brexit's now here, UKIP changes its name, and then it becomes the Brexit Party because it's not exactly the kind of Brexit they want. And then they've got somebody who's kind of finishing off Brexit, and then the next version of it is Reform.
I agree.
I'm just saying,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if this is true, but my instinct would be, if Keir Starmer managed to control immigration, and that is a massive if, and it is, it's a big job ahead. But if he even started making progress on that, I think the Reform would just change their spots. There'd
Sure.
always be something
But
that whoever was in power wasn't doing as they wanted it to be
But
done.
the immigration argument has been a central feature going from UKIP to the Brexit Party. It's about the need to get immigration under control, and people were promised a whole heap of things when the free movement of people would stop when we leave the European Union, and we've seen what's happened to immigration figures reaching over 900,000. So I do think that is the consistent bit of messaging.
But if you
no
think
one's
about it,
going to
but
reform
all I'm saying
for their
is
education policy or their health policy or what they're going to do about pensions.
But the figures have got worse. So when we voted for Brexit,
Yeah.
immigration figures weren't that bad.
Well, that's why Reform have continued to be so popular.
It's deeper than that, though, isn't it, as well? Because Reform are doing, as Trump has done, as we've seen, better and better, in particular with young men, young people, Gen Z. And a lot of that is not motivated by immigration. There is something wider, there is something more cultural, there's something subversive, there's something countercultural about Trump and about Farage. All of these kids who've actually grown up in this era, and actually these people do not seem that anomalous.
It's a kick 'em
they just
out
seem
thing.
appealing. It's a completely, and I think that is where the money comes in, and where the money is potentially to the established parties really, really dangerous. And I think there's two options ahead for Labour. Starmer could hope basically Musk kind of gets bored, which he might. Then he might get bored of all this politics stuff. He might fall
He
out
seems
with
to quite
Trump.
like power.
He does like power, but he
Yeah,
might
but there's
get,
still France, there's still Germany, there's still Italy.
he might fall out with Trump. Who knows? He's such a mercurial, quixotic character. So you hope it just kind of like goes away. But if it doesn't,
That's too kind.
okay. If it doesn't go away, then I think that they need to be taking this seriously, because he's obviously someone who wants a bigger and bigger part in our politics.
You don't want Musk as the leader of the opposition in this country, do you?
Well, there's a question, isn't there? It's like, at some point, who is more powerful? Is it these plutocrats? Is it these multi-billionaires around the world? Or is it nation states? That's the irony. The irony here.
Or is it voters?
Well,
I mean, is
that's
it
what I
voters
mean.
within the
But
nation
that's-
states?
But
Yeah.
that's the irony here. These guys go around basically saying that ordinary people don't have any power, and we want the nation state back, and we want all of this. But what are we talking about here? We're talking about the richest man in the world. We're talking about plutocrats. And at some point, Democratic politicians have to decide where the line in the sand is.
In a moment, we will be back, and we'll be talking the Middle East, but not Gaza and not Lebanon, but Syria, and what on earth has just been unfolding there over the past few days. There was a conference that took place in Italy last week on the future of the Middle East, and they were talking about Gaza, and they were talking about Lebanon, and the conference ended, and there had been zero discussion on Syria. And the next day, a rebel group take Syria's second city, Aleppo. And everyone's going, what? The civil war in Syria is alive and well and flourishing in a way that President Assad thought had gone away, that he had won. He'd been let back into the Arab League. He was reinstituting himself in Arab politics.
We'd all stop looking.
And we'd all stop
looking at Syria. And what happened was basically the work of an Islamist militant group. It's called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and part of these other allied factions that were backed by Turkey. And they came in, controlled Aleppo, 300 people, including 20 civilians, killed there. And then you had a sort of response from Russia, who has been backing Bashar al-Assad up till now, hitting Aleppo for the first time since 2016. So nearly a decade ago. And it just reminds you that when the cameras go off or when the journalists aren't allowed in, we sort of assume there's nothing to see. But this civil war has been going on now since 2010, 2011.
Exactly. But this jihadist group kind of suddenly looked around at the map of the Middle East and saw, Hezbollah radically weakened. Hezbollah had been a crucial force defending Bashar al-Assad. The Russians, they've got their hands full a bit with Ukraine.
Yeah.
They can't do much. Yeah. Iran has been supporting the Houthi rebels, has been supporting Hamas, has been supporting Hezbollah. None of that going very well. So Iran doesn't want to get involved. What a time to strike
Open
if
goal.
you are that rebel group.
Yeah.
And they have taken full advantage and taken Syria by surprise.
But it won't surprise you to hear that it's not just a battle between Assad's forces and this new group. There are about 5 different, call them opposition parties, call them rebel groups, call them factions, who are all fighting to control Syria now. And to help us work out just what is at play here, we're going to speak to our friend of the podcast, Tim Marshall, who has written extensively on this part of the world and travelled to much of it.
Tim, very good to have you with us. How much of a moment is this? And how much has it caught everyone by surprise? What has unfolded in Syria over the past 3-4 days?
Well, it's a big moment, but it's a continuation. And forgive me for sounding wise after the event. It's not that big a surprise if you follow these things. The civil war in Syria was only, I wouldn't even say frozen. It just sort of paused with skirmishing happening ever since about 2016. But in the last year, you've had the Ukraine war. So the Russians, who are present in Syria and have long shored up the Assad regime against the rebels, well, they took a lot of their planes and went back to fight the Ukraine war, and a lot of their troops. They have left some. So that makes the regime even more brittle. And then in the last year, Israel, Hezbollah. At one point, Hezbollah had the best part of 5,000 combat troops fighting to support Assad against the rebels in Syria. Well, they went home and they were in no position at the moment to shore up the regime. So you put that timing in, and here's the last bit. Turkey has lots of designs on Syria, not least it wants an entire buffer zone along the entire northern Syrian border with Turkey, which Turkey controls. And it wants that to prevent any pockets of Kurdish militias which can threaten Turkey. So they were involved in diplomatic negotiations with Syria. That fell apart a few weeks ago. It was thought, actually, this offensive might have happened as early as the beginning of October. Once Ankara realized that they're not going to get what they want out of Assad in Damascus, it looks to me that the 3 different ducks aligned in a row, and they gave the green light to the rebel Islamist groups and said, now is the time.
Tim, I'm going to sound slightly odd here, but there are essentially about 5 different sort of opposition parties or groups.
Yeah.
Who do we think of as the goodies? I mean, who, because it's not Bashar al-Assad. And then you look at the other groups that are coming and you think, oh, well, therefore we want the opposition to win. But some of the opposition groups are like Islamic State, and some of them are the other sort of, terror-related groups. Is there a sense of, basic good versus bad in this one?
Not really. If there's one group which has been less brutal than any other group, then it's the Kurdish fighters.
Who were
But
fighting with the Americans, weren't they, to
yes,
get rid of ISIS?
yeah, and they have their moments. And anyway, to try and shore up their position, they have partially aligned themselves with the Assad regime since things quietened down in 2016. But they've always been thrown under a bus because they're the smallest group. So, there are no good guys really. I'm reminded of the old Kissinger remark about the Iran-Iraq war. I wish they could both lose. So if we look at it, this well, they're not a new group, but Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. This is the largest of the Islamist groups. Used to be called the Nusra Front, grew out of Al-Qaeda. They're the ones that are spearheading and the ones that have taken Aleppo, the second city.
So you're saying that's not a good move? I mean, it's not really a good move. It's just...
Well, all right, their end game is to control the whole of Syria. I doubt they can do that. And it's not good because they've tried to persuade everybody they're a sort of pragmatic, not particularly kidnap foreigners and assassinate them or even chop their heads off. They've been trying to present themselves as sort of slightly more reasonable. They want the whole of Syria. I don't think they can get it. Turkey, as we said, wants to weaken Assad, weaken the Kurds, establish the buffer zone, and start pushing the Syrian refugees back into Syria. They host 3.5 million of them. Russia, which has begun to strike back because it did leave some troops and some planes, it wants to keep Assad as its puppet, so it still has a foothold in the Middle East. And remember, it's got an air base in Syria, which Assad loaned them for 100 years to say thank you for saving me. And they've got a port in the port of Tartus. It's a small military port. The last player is Iran. Iran also wants Assad to survive because it wants to keep its corridor to the Mediterranean open. So think of the map: Iran, across to Iraq, across to Syria, across to Lebanon and Hezbollah and the Mediterranean. So on the one side, the Islamist militias and Turkey. On the other side, Russia and Iran trying to prop up the regime, and it's exploded back into life.
So that's that sets the stage. But you have got Hezbollah, who have fought with the Assad regime,
Yes.
dramatically weakened after the the confrontation with Israel. You've got Russia preoccupied by Ukraine. You've got Iran slightly wary about, because it's also taken losses because of Hamas and Hezbollah. Is Assad vulnerable now?
He's vulnerable, but I'm a minority, I think, of people watching this closely in thinking that I don't think Damascus will fall. We shall see. But you're right to put all those things into position, because that is exactly why the timing is now. I mean, at any point in the last 8 years, had these stars all aligned, this would have happened. It's just that they happen to have aligned just recently. So at the moment, this week, Aleppo has fallen. They're trying to shore up their defences. They've advanced southwards from Aleppo. There's only one motorway in Syria, and it connects down to Hama, and then Homs, and then Damascus. So they're going down south. They're approaching this city called Hama, and they may well try to take it. If they did, then the road is open to Homs, and if they take that, the road is open to Damascus. But once the Russian Air Force goes into action, it'll be very hard to keep advancing. They may simply consolidate and think, we've got the second city, Aleppo, we might just try to consolidate our gains. And although it's unlikely the Iranian Revolutionary Guard are going to show up in numbers, as they did during the real fighting 10 years ago, and Hezbollah simply cannot spare their fighters. I mean, imagine if the ceasefire completely breaks down between Israel and Hezbollah. They can't be having 4,000 or 5,000 combat experienced troops fighting in Syria. They need them on their border. And that only leaves what is happening. Iran has some proxy militias in Iraq, and several hundred Iraqi fighters, loyal partially to Iran, have crossed the border in the past 2 or 3 days out of Iraq into Syria. So they will join the Syrian government troops, the Russian troops, and probably the Wagner group, now called the Afrika Korps, the Russian militia. And I suspect with their weaponry, they may have enough to stem the tide. And so it could die down in a few weeks. Or I could be wrong. They could continue to crumble, and they would love to take Damascus, but that's a much, much bigger ask than taking Aleppo, which is a pretty big ask, and they have had a stunning victory. There's no question about that.
And Tim, last thought, do you see this as isolated to the other conflicts that we're looking at in the Middle East, to Israel, Gaza, and to Lebanon? I mean, is this all part of the same thing now?
Don't you hate it when people say yes and no? But that's the answer. Yes, it's related insofar as we set out. It's because Assad is so fragile, and he's so fragile because of the Ukrainian war and the Israel-Lebanon Hezbollah war and the subsequent weakening of Iran. But it's not the no bit of the answer is that this is about Syria and the Syrian groups trying to get control from the Syrian army. But Syria has always been a deadly playground for the outside powers. So, that's my yes and no answer, which I know is unsatisfactory, but it is connected to the wider conflicts insofar as it informs them of what they can and can't do within Syria.
Well, this is an odd way to end the podcast, but I think you will be grateful that we did, because some extraordinary news is coming in. We're just recording at 2:00. And we are hearing that South Korea's president has declared emergency martial law in the last half an hour. Unannounced, late-night television address. He is worried and needs to protect the country from North Korea's communist forces.
Yeah,
Thoughts?
It's a weird story. I mean, late night, as we're recording, it's 11 o'clock in Seoul, unannounced TV address from the president, and he said he's declaring martial law, i.e. military law, to, quote, safeguard a liberal South Korea from the threats posed by North Korea's communist forces and to eliminate anti-state elements. I hereby declare emergency martial law, i.e. he's implying that there are elements of the opposition in the South Korean parliament which are in some way being influenced or controlled by North Korea, and thereby he's having to take emergency action to try and arrest the situation.
But also, martial law takes away power from the civilian government, because the law is now being controlled by the military through the decrees of the president. So another way of framing this is that it is the suspension of normal democracy in South Korea. If what we're reading on the wires coming out of South Korea is correct. As I say, this is all happening, in the last few moments. But something quite extraordinary seems to be unfolding in South Korea in terms of its relationship with the North and what the president has felt it necessary to do.
Yeah, and it's a very unstable sort of government at the moment. They had elections back in April, and at that point, the opposition party started gaining seats quite considerably, and it has made it very hard for Yoon, for the president of South Korea, to remain in office for 3 years. In other words, he's the president, but what is happening, I mean, not dissimilar to what we're sort of seeing in France, I suppose, is a very different parliamentary setup to what's going on with the presidency, which is creating this aura, perhaps, of instability.
Yeah, and martial law has been declared in South Korea a few times since it became a democracy, not since the 80s. But I suppose there is. I mean, obviously, we'll just have to wait and see what happens. I don't think any of us are necessarily experts on South Korean politics, so we'll doubtless be hearing from people who are.
Speak for yourself.
Well, indeed, yeah.
I could tell you about the
I'm
South
more of a-
Korean Chaebol.
I'm more of a Bhutan man myself, but nonetheless, clearly we know what the tensions are like between North Korea and South Korea. We know that it is itself a fault line in lots of ways between West and China and Russia and all of these sorts of things. So
I will
if
tell
there is
you one
instability
extraordinary
in
thing,
South
actually,
Korea,
about South
it just adds to the many geopolitical instabilities and fault lines that we're seeing dominate the world at the moment.
I will tell you one extraordinary thing about South Korea, which was during the financial crash of the late 90s. They called on people to bring their belongings to help the government, sort of bail out the government. And the key sort of special insignia of South Korea is the tortoise. And people would come with their gold tortoises and offer them to the government and say, this is to try and help stabilise the situation. It's a very, very different situation to what we would have in Western countries. It's a very, very different sense of perspective with your own government when you think that you are part of helping the government, helping the state by offering up whatever you've got at home. It's an extraordinary moment.
15th biggest economy in the world, big US ally, it matters what's going on there.
Oh, absolutely, it matters. Look, we'll be following this closely. I suspect you'll be hearing more about this tomorrow. But until then, bye-bye.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.